Good morning. I want to share something really profound and important with you. Beginning in chapter 8 of the Book of Jasher, it talks about the life of Abraham. It begins by giving us some background on his father, Terach. I believe that's the way you pronounce it. But Terach, he worked for Nimrod. He was the prince of his host, and he was the highest man in Nimrod's kingdom. And he found out that he was having a boy, and then when his wife gave birth to that boy, Abraham, he was so excited, and he had a lot of the people from Nimrod's kingdom to come out and celebrate with him in his house. Some of the soothsayers and the wise men there. And when they left the house, they saw a sight in the heavens. They saw this star, and it was going around and eating up the other stars. And they knew that this child was a threat to the kingdom of Nimrod. And so, anyway, they decided, well, if we don't say anything, what's going to happen is that Nimrod's going to find out, and then he's going to have all of our heads. So we'd better go and tell him. So they went and told Nimrod about it, and then Nimrod calls Terach before him, and he wants him to bring him the child so that he can kill him. And so Terach said, well, my heart is just really tender towards the boy. Would you please give me 3 days? And in the meanwhile, Terach went home, and there was a housemaid there, and she gave birth. And what Terach did was he took that baby up there to Nimrod, posed as Abraham. And so Nimrod took the baby, and he just smashed him against the pavement and killed him. And Terach, he sent his wife and Abraham away to the caves, and monthly he sent provisions for them, and that's where they remained for the first 10 years of Abraham's life. And after that, Abraham was sent to his great grandfather Noah and Shem, and he remained with them for 39 years, learning the ways of the Father. And at Noah's death, he came and he returned to the house of Terach. And when he did, he saw that his father just worshipped and had all kinds of idols in his house. And this just really infuriated Abraham. And so, anyway, long story short, Abraham went and smashed all of the idols and put the hammer or the axe in the hand of one of the idols, and then told his father this story about his mother cooking this stew and taking it to the idols, and then the strong one took and smashed all of the rest. And so his father said, oh, this is nonsense. And he said, they can't do that. They're made out of wood and stone. And Abraham says, exactly. So why are you worshiping them? Well, Terach was just really bent out of shape. So he goes to Nimrod over his son, and he tells Nimrod what he did. And, that really sets Nimrod off. So Nimrod, he calls all the kings together, and he says, well, if this happened, what would you do? And they said, well, we would just, he should be hanged on a tree, but having done all the things that he said and having despised our Elohim, he said, he must be burned to death. This is the law in this matter. So what they did was Abraham, he was put in prison for 10 days. Now that is significant. Think back to Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. God tells the church, he says, do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you might be tested, and you'll have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. And so he was in prison for those 10 days while Nimrod was talking to the kings and deciding what should happen to him. And like I said, they decided that he should be burned. So, they fire up the furnace and get it really hot. And then Nimrod, he goes back to Terach again. And he said, how could you do this thing to me and transgress my orders and give me a child that you didn't beget? And he said, well, my feelings were so tender towards him. And so he was terrified about that. And the king said, well, you know what? Who advised you to do this? You tell me that, and I'll not kill you. I'll not require your life. And so Terach was terrified, and so he sells his other son down the road, Haran, and he tells him that Haran told him to do that. And so Haran had advised his father to do that, but they took Haran into custody. And this is really important. In verse 18 and 19 of chapter 12 in the Book of Jasher, it says, and Haran at that time felt inclined to follow the ways of Abraham, but he kept it within himself. And Haran said in his heart, behold, now the king has seized Abram on account of these things which Abram did, and it shall come to pass that if Abram prevail over the king, then I'll follow him. But if the king prevail, then I'll go after the king. So Haran's heart was divided. And so they take Haran and they take Abraham and they strip them of all of their clothes except their lower garments. And then they bind their hands and feet with linen cords. And then Nimrod's servants, they lift them both up and they throw them into the furnace. And this is another important part, and I ask that you drink this in. Verses 24 through 27 in chapter 12 says, and Yahuwah loved Abram, and he had compassion over him. And Yahuwah came down and delivered Abram from the fire, and he was not burned, but all the cords with which they bound him were burned, while Abram remained and walked about in the fire. And Haran died when they had cast him into the fire, and he was burned to ashes. For his heart was not perfect with Yahuwah. And whose men who cast him into the fire, the flame of the fire spread over them, and they were burned. And 12 of those men that threw them in died. And Abram, he walked in the midst of the fire for 3 days and 3 nights. And all the servants of the king saw him, and they saw him walking in the fire, and they have seen Abraham walking about in the midst of the fire, and they said that his lower garments were on him, and he wasn't burned, but the cord that he was bound with was. Now, I mention all of this. I want you to think about the scriptures too. In Jonah chapter 1, verse 17, it talks about Jonah being in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 40, it tells us that just like Jonah, so the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2, pay attention to this. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon you. It is so important for us to refine ourselves before the Lord right now. Our hearts must be pure. Do you remember what it said about Aaron? He was burned to ashes, for his heart was not perfect with Yahuwah. The time to make our hearts and minds and lives right before Him is now. Don't wait until the fire comes. Seek Him while He may be found. Call upon His name. If you seek Him, you will find Him if you search for Him with all of your heart.